Greetings and welcome to another exciting lecture in geomorphology. We are finally closing out our discussion of hill slopes, and we are moving to another case example. We are going to be talking about uh, the reading for today. The reading for today, Los Angeles Against the Mountains by John McPhee. You read it as a New Yorker article, but it is also published as a book chapter in his very important book called The Control of Nature. And so today we're going to explore in a little bit more detail the geological circumstances that allow Los Angeles to be kind of the perfect place for large debris flows. And we'll learn about what those are, and then we'll move on and we'll talk about Los Angeles's attempt to mitigate that hazard associated with large debris flows. So that's our plan for today. Los Angeles Against the Mountain. Let's get started. Okay. So let's start with the background here. What is going on? First of all, we're in Los Angeles in Southern California. And if we think about Los Angeles as a huge megacity, as it grows and expands, it really, sorry about that. As it grows and it expands, we really have limited capacity for growth in only a couple of directions. And that's because if we look at LA, we look down here to the west, we have the Pacific Ocean. So we can't have any more development out here in the ocean. And so where do people end up moving? If this is downtown LA right here, basically this entire area is filled with development now. And now we get essentially the pushing of people further and further into the mountains and farther away. Okay, farther away from the city center and into the mountains. And that's a concept that's been very common. You probably learned about it in another class as well. That's the increase in the urban wildland interface, basically that boundary between people and the natural environment. And oftentimes that's in steep mountainous terrain. And we're going to see that that's some of the problem here in this story. Okay, so after growing north-south along the coast, basically if you want to be close to LA, the only way left to go is you're going to be building up towards the mountains to the east. And so that means that you have this incredibly steep mountain range right here, the San Gabriel Mountains, and that people are moving right up to this boundary right here in the San Gabes. Okay, so that's kind of the population setting. We're getting people moving towards the mountains. Well, what about the mountains themselves? Well, remember I said at the beginning that this is really the perfect recipe for debris flows that we have here in the Los Angeles area. And part of that is what the mountains are made of themselves. The San Gabriel Mountains are some of the steepest mountains in the country. They rise essentially from sea level to over 10,000 feet in elevation. This is one of the most tectonically active and fastest growing mountain ranges in the world. Okay, so here are the San Gabes right here, and then we're seeing some faults that are cut through. So we get very, very, very steep mountains. So what's driving the uplift of these mountains? It's movement along the San Andreas Fault. So here's the San Andreas Fault going through Western North America here. And notice right in LA, there's this little kink. So you get this little kink in the fault right here. And what that means is you have extreme pressure and extreme forces as essentially we're accommodating this movement. And that means that we have a lot of earthquakes and a lot of faulting in rocks that are just completely beaten up in this area. And so, okay, all right, let's go to our top image here. Here's that San Andreas Fault. Right there, San Andreas Fault. And then here are the San Gabriel Mountains and Gabe Fault right here. So these rocks are right in the middle of this major kink in the San Andreas Fault. And so because of that, these rocks we're going to see are just completely busted up. And so what you have are very, very, very steep mountains of highly, highly fractured rock. So this rock is just beat up. If we take another look here, here's Telegraph Peak in the San Gabriel Mountains. And look at these rocks. You guys see these? It's just basically loose rock. It's completely beat up. And so because of that, you have a lot of sediment that's available to be moved down off the hill slopes. And so what we see in the mountains are plenty of sediment for these debris flows. And we learned a little bit earlier in the week about the production of talus and scree. these piles of sediment at the base of mountains where we're having rock fall. And so in the sand gabes, we have lots and lots of this available sediment, this talus material. So again, in terms of priming the pump here for these perfect conditions for debris flows, we've got people that are moving into these mountains. These mountains are very steep, they're very tall, and they're full of busted up bedrock. So there's two reasons why this is important. Let's move on here. What about the vegetation in the mountains surrounding Los Angeles? Well, we generally see a lot of what's called chaparral vegetation. Chaparral is a plant community that's adapted to living in Mediterranean climates. So what's a Mediterranean climate? Mediterranean climate is kind of cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. And so because of that, you've got vegetation that's evolved to preserve water during hot, dry seasons. And so what we end up having is vegetation with a lot of wax in their leaves so that you don't get a lot of transpiration out of the leaves and moisture loss. And so this vegetation, it gets very dense. You get this dense ground cover of this really waxy vegetation. So it's high density, high surface area, and lots of these oils and resins that are in the vegetation. So again, if we think about this, this is some vegetation that can burn very rapidly, very quickly, and very hotly. Okay, let's add in the next circumstance that makes this so unique here. We have what are called the Santa Ana winds. So what often happens is we'll have these huge high pressure systems develop over the western United States with low pressures that develop out in the Pacific. And so what happens is the air is in a gradient. It's moving from a high pressure system where there's a lot of air to low pressure out at sea. And so nature abhors a vacuum, and so that air is moving from the high pressure to low pressures. And so we end up blowing this air over Southern California. Now, what can we say about this high pressure air in the middle of the western United States? Well, we can say that it's in the middle of this landmass, so it's heating up, especially during the summer months. So it's hot air, and there's not a lot of moisture sources around, so it's incredibly dry air. We get this hot, dry air that builds up in the center of the continent, and then it kind of gets flushed out to the ocean, and at the time it gets pushed over Southern California. And what happens is, as the winds are pushed over the San Gabriel Mountains and other mountains, we end up kind of increasing the speed of those winds because we shrink the amount of space that the winds are flowing over. When there's a mountain, the air gets kind of pushed into this smaller area, and when it does that, the velocity has to increase. So you end up generating these incredibly powerful winds. We call these Santa Ana winds. So you push them up over the mountains, and this hot, fast air gets kind of flushed down the leeward side of the leeward side of the mountains. We get this hot, dry air that dries out the chaparral vegetation. And at that point, all you need is a spark. And so there's lots of ways you can generate a spark. We can have lightning that causes these fires. I don't know why I still include this picture, but it cracks me up that if someone's out there with their musket, there might be some sparks. But anything can start these fires. We can have inadvertent starting of fires with a careless toss of a cigarette. We can have people starting fires on purpose. Another major cause recently has been downed power lines. And so when you have these windy conditions, your power lines get blown over, and then they arc. When the power line's severed, it arcs and it starts a fire on the ground. And so we can have tremendous fires. And so these are pictures showing the smoke from these images. But those of you watching this video around the time I made this, 2020, just Google wildfires in the western United States, and you can see even more smoke from the forest fires that are happening right now. I will note that at the time of I'm recording this, it's right during the middle of the 2020 fires, and we are confined to our house as the air quality in Walla Walla is at hazardous levels. So we get these big wildfires. So here's pictures of what these wildfires look like as they're burning through the chaparral in the San Gabriel Mountains. And as I mentioned, I think they burn hot and they burn fast through the chaparral, that dried out, oily vegetation. Okay, so now what do our slopes look like? Well, now we've got oversteepened slopes with tons of sediment with no vegetation on them. And so basically we've oversteepened these beyond the angle of repose because we've changed the environmental conditions. We removed the root strength and everything. And so these slopes will just start to fail on their own. We call this dry ravel. And this picture right here, we're showing dry ravel, where essentially sediment is just rolling down the hill slope. And so these slopes are primed for a big mass movement. Now all you need is some water. And so I mentioned we're in a Mediterranean climate, so it's dry in the summer. So everything gets dried out and burned in the summer. And then we move into the winter when we can get some convective storms coming off the Pacific, and we can dump rain and snow up in the mountains and trigger massive, massive flooding that causes debris flows. So we've got a system that's now primed perfectly for debris flows. So everyone follow those steps. Lots of people close to the mountains, deep rocks beaten up completely to the point where you've got a ton of easily available sediment. We got chaparral on there. We dry out that chaparral, we burn it, and then that next winter or even the winter after, we have a big rainstorm that dumps out water. And so we can trigger these huge, huge debris flows. So these are all sediments moving in the debris flow. Remember, we can get really, really big rocks moving in these things because of the nonlinear nature of non-Newtonian fluids with respect to their shear strength. And so we can pick up really, really big rocks. And here's some pictures of houses here at the urban wildland interface where they will fill up several meters with debris. Another picture of the back of someone's house, well over 10 feet of debris. Okay, so again, we know about these hazards associated with flash flooding, and so there's hazard signs in the San Gabriel Mountains that when it rains, that water is concentrated and moves down through these channels that are filled with old debris flow deposits. Here's another picture of a washed out road from flooding back in 1969, and we're going to see some video of the 2003 event as well. All right, let's watch that right now. So here is debris flows associated with this exact process outside of LA. So I'm going to move off to the side and we can watch this debris flow event. Notice the dampened turbulence. This is not normal water flow. What we're looking at is debris flow. And so look at the size of the boulders that are moving in this water. If this were in this fluid, if this were just plain water, you wouldn't be able to move these big boulders. But because of the increased strength, debris flows, we can move these really big blocks. And we see the aftermath on the sides. And look at the size of some of these boulders, huge boulders in this free flow event. That's all the good stuff on this. Let's move on. Okay, so what we see is that we've had really, really large floods in LA that happen not necessarily every 5 years, but maybe every 15 or 10 to 15 years. And so these have happened historically. And so land managers and city managers in LA have realized that this is a huge problem of debris flows. And so they've developed a system for mitigating the risks associated with these debris flows. And what these are essentially a series of sediment traps in the mountains that try and keep the sediment up in the mountains and not down on the valley floor. And so we build things like huge debris dams. Here's the San Gabriel Dam right here. And the idea is that your debris flows, they come down and they end up getting dumped into the dam here, behind the dam, and you can't, and then it never makes it down to where people. Here's another picture of what this is. So this is designed, it's not designed to hold water all the time. A dam like this is just designed to catch sediment behind it during debris flow events. So what we see is, as we mentioned, that more and more people want to live here. So there's new development just down the road from and look at how bouldery it is in behind the dam. These are all old debris flow deposits. There are pictures showing them. And LA hasn't just built one of these or two of these. We have a system of, put it over here, there we go, 15 dams and 115 debris basins. These are just these like low points up in the mountains where you're trying to catch all this sediment. And so this is the flood control system that's maintained by the Army Corps, the LA County Public Works Department. So look here, here's a map showing Los Angeles, and all of these red dots are debris basins, and then the black triangles are debris dams. So we build these wherever there's essentially a valley that's going to lead out to a populated area. And so the idea is to catch the debris flows up in the mountains. Okay, here's another one of these. And again, notice how close the people are to these control structures. So here, we've got the debris dam here. Then notice these things have an outlet on them as well. We'll talk about these outlets in a second. Because the idea is to trap the sediment up here. And then, of course, you feel safe. Would you want to live? This is where the debris flows are supposed to be. And then your house is right on the other. Okay. As I mentioned, the debris dams, they're in the front of them. They actually are open in the front. And so the idea is that you can force the water out, and you channel the water and channelize the water in these big channels that then move it through the city of Los Angeles and then out to the ocean. So that's why you have all these dry concrete channels. And I was in Albuquerque, we called these arroyos. These are here to flush that water out during these big winter storms. Of course, what I know these for at my advanced age was a little movie that came out back in the 90s called Terminator 2, where there was a big chase scene with Arnold Schwarzenegger and other guy in these, basically these concrete channels. So this is the stunt double for Arnold jumping off one of the structures. Clearly not Arnold. Okay, so here's what these spillways look like, these concrete spillways. And let's look right in at 5400 Pinecone Road. This is the story you read about at the beginning of the chapter of the Los Angeles Against the Mountains. This is where the Genophile family home is located. And so here's the actual house where they talk about being buried up to the second story. So there was a debris basin built upstream of them after this event. So again, look at the steep mountains right up here. These are where these debris flows can get triggered and then dump out down here. More pictures of these. And we put some large parks in with these drainage basins or these debris basins as well. Okay, So that's the story of Los Angeles against the mountain. It's a fascinating story in history. This article is a little bit dated now, right? It's well over 30 years old. But it's really, really important for thinking about the future and mitigation of debris hazards in the future. And what we're going to see is the story of Los Angeles is actually not that unique. Yes, LA has these perfect circumstances, but we're going to see the potential for more people impacted by debris flows in the future because of two issues. And one is population growth in the western United States is moving more people away from flat valley floors and up into the mountains. And so we're increasing that area of urban wildland interface. And also, climate change is changing the frequency, the severity, and the size of forest fires. They're increasing. And so because of that, we're going to be burning more landscapes that will be susceptible to debris flows in the future. So just some example of this. This is a nice study showing new areas of the wildland urban interface. And so in red here is over, since I think 1950, increases in the urban wildland interface. And so you can see all the mountain fronts here in the western United States and all the way up to in the Cascade Range, and then all the way down into the Sierra Nevadas, and also along the Wasatch Range, and also the Bitterroots and other mountains in the Northern Rockies as well. And so we're increasing the number of people in these mountainous terrains. That second point, forest fires, they're increasing. So since 1950, just the total number of forest fires over time has been increasing. Note here that this only goes to 2017. So of course, 2020, that wildfires today are not on this graph. And so this is going to increase, keep going up. We see that the number of megafires, these are big areas that burn over 100,000 square acres. These are also increasing since 50 as well. Interestingly, only 11% of the West has burned since 1950s. This graphic here, the yellow are forest fires, the purple is private lands, and then the white is public lands. And the point here is that, yes, we've had severe forest fires, but there's plenty of other landscapes and parts of the West that can burn in the future. And that includes the Cascades that are on fire right now and the west side of the Cascade. So we see that potentially there is going to be an increased likelihood of large fires. So this is looking at the fire season and the increase in weeks with very large fires, how that's going to change as we model into the future. So lots of the western United States and the steep west are going to be more likely to be burned. And that has the potential for increasing hazards associated with debris flows. So again, this is an issue that's absolutely relevant to us today, and we have to understand the mechanisms of these debris flows, where they're going to happen, so that we can have reasonable planning and reasonable mitigation strategies for large debris. Okay, that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this. It's a great read by John McPhee. This is it for Hill Slopes. The next time you see me, we'll be coming back and we'll be talking about channels. So have a great day, and we'll see you later. Bye.